This is the most sophisticated villain on Better Call Saul, and the one who can endure the most humiliation, and who many people love even more than the show's main character. He is the very same Gus who will one day have the world's top contraband maker, Walter, and the largest underground processing facility. However, the road to success is never smooth. In Better Call Saul, Gus is still a subordinate of Don, the leader of a Mexican criminal organization, to build his own business empire. Gus used various tactics to undermine Hector's sales channels. His exceptional performance earned him the favor of Don. Feeling neglected by the boss, Hector, backed by the Salamanca family's power, starts to threaten and oppress Gus. Hector seems to have succeeded, but little does he know that his intelligence is no match for Gus. During a designated distribution of goods, Hector insisted that his men take an extra parcel to show his superiority. In the previous season's finale, Nacho, in order to protect his father's business, secretly swapped Hector's heart medication. During a meeting with Gus, Hector has a heart attack due to emotional agitation, and the swapped medication fails to work, causing him to collapse. Nacho thinks his plan is flawless, but he still can't escape Gus's sharp eyes. Nacho's destruction of evidence was monitored by Gus's men. However, Gus can't let Hector die just yet, so he brings in Barry to examine Hector. The prognosis is grim, and Barry suggests giving up on treatment, thinking a scoundrel like Hector deserves to die. But Gus is not pleased with this.
I decide what he deserves. No one else.
He remembers the scene of Max being killed by Hector, and vows to kill Hector himself to avenge Max. He arranges for Maureen, the best doctor in the country, to treat Hector. The cousins, acting as family members, come to take care of their uncle. Maureen suggests they talk to the patient more to stimulate his brain, but getting the cousins to talk more is like pulling teeth, so this task falls to Arturo and Nacho. When Gus receives Hector's hospital report, a plan forms in his mind, and he instructs Tyrus and Victor to carry it out. That night, Hector's men Nacho and Arturo arrive to pick up the goods. Relying on the power of the Salamanca family, Arturo demanded 6 packs of contraband again. Nacho remains loyal to Hector's side. At first, both sides are at a standoff. Then Tyrus signals Victor, and they pretend to yield, letting them think they've won. Nacho and Arturo assume Gus's men are cowards and lower their guard. Little do they know, Gus and his men, who had been lying in wait, rush in from behind. They don't kill Nacho, but they suffocate Arturo to death.
I know what you've done. The Salamancas, they do not. Do you understand what I'm saying? Look at me. From now on, you are mine.
From this point on, Nacho becomes Gus's mole in the Salamanca family. Nacho feels a bit desperate, as he had just promised his father that he would find a way out of the Salamanca family. Now, it seems very difficult to achieve this. On the other side, upon learning of his brother's death, Jimmy rushes to the scene, but unfortunately, he doesn't get to see his brother one last time. The last time Jimmy saw Chuck, he was still normally using various electrical appliances. In Chuck's backyard, Jimmy finds many appliances that had been moved outside, leading him to conclude that Chuck had relapsed for some reason. Back home, Jimmy is still immersed in his grief, unable to extricate himself. Kim understands Jimmy's feelings and brings out the sapphire gin they didn't finish last time. Pouring some for Jimmy, they sit silently on the couch, drinking until dawn. Howard organizes the memorial service, and almost all the prominent figures in the legal community attend, including Chuck's ex-wife, Rebecca, who also comes to pay her respects. When Jimmy and Kim return home, they find Howard waiting at their doorstep. It turned out that Howard thought that he had forced Chuck to resign, which led to Chuck's suicide, and he felt that he could not hide the truth from Jimmy. This action greatly endears Howard to the audience. Howard confesses everything to Jimmy, explaining that due to Chuck, the firm's overall insurance premiums had increased, and for the sake of the firm, he had considered forcing Chuck to retire. Unexpectedly, Jimmy pretends to know nothing about the insurance issue, even though he instigated it and does not confess. This starkly contrasts with Howard's honesty.
It never occurred to me that I could hurt him. He always seemed so strong. But he wasn't. I think he did what he did because of me.
Well, Howard, I guess that's your cross to bear.
They never expected Jimmy to say such a thing, leaving both Kim and Howard bewildered. In truth, Jimmy feels guilty about Chuck's death, but upon hearing Howard's confession, he shifts all the blame onto Howard. From this point on, Jimmy begins to learn how to avoid responsibility, a theme that will run throughout the subsequent storyline.
So I'm gonna make some coffee. Anybody want some?
To turn Nacho into his spy within the Salamanca family, Gus arranges for his men to stage a murder scene. They drive Arturo's car over a spike strip, then drag the preserved body of Arturo from the trunk to the driver's seat. Next, Victor and Tyrus fired a barrage of bullets to create the illusion that they had been ambushed by a rival group. Then they had Nacho sit in the car. They deliberately shot him in non-lethal areas, giving Nacho a chance to escape. To make the act more convincing, Victor shoots Nacho in the abdomen, then tosses him a phone to call the Salamanca family for help. Soon, the cousins arrive at the scene. They find Arturo dead and follow the blood trail to a barely conscious Nacho. The cousins rescue Nacho and load him into their car. They try to question him about the attackers, but Nacho claims he didn't see them clearly, so they focus on saving Nacho, who has served their family well. To avoid unnecessary trouble, they destroy Arturo's body in the car before leaving. Unable to go to a regular hospital, they turn to the versatile Caldera for help. Fortunately, both of the cousins are also O-negative, so Nacho doesn't die from blood loss. Caldera was tired of dealing with these issues, and he warned Nacho not to come to him again. Meanwhile, Gus receives a call from his superior, Juan, who informs him about the attack on Hector's man. Gus pretends he doesn't know anything about it and guesses their route is being watched. Juan instructs Gus to send out decoy trucks to avoid hijacking and asks how long the current supply will last. Gus estimates they can manage for another day or two. Upon hearing this, Juan tells Gus to find a local supplier, and Gus reminds Juan that their boss, Don, won't agree. Juan assures him that he will convince the boss. This has been Gus's true aim all along. Gus then went to a university, where he had already groomed his own contraband maker, Gale, who once partnered with Walter in Breaking Bad, is deeply passionate about chemistry and relatively naive. Gus was there to check the purity of the contraband that Gale had been researching. Gale's tests reveal that the purity falls short of their standards. Gale said that he could produce high-purity contraband right now without anyone detecting it. It's clear he is eager to repay Gus for his support. This scene connects to Breaking Bad, where Gale's murder site contained Gus's fingerprints, which Gus explained as being from a former student he had sponsored. However, the ever-cautious Gus declines Gale's offer, instructing him to continue focusing on his chemistry studies and await further instructions. Gus realizes that it's time to proceed with the construction of his underground lab. On the other side, the newly recovered Nacho headed to the criminal gang's territory with the cousins. He intends to frame someone else for the Salamanca attack. Nacho casually points to a car, claiming it was the one that forced them off the road. Nacho suggests that they're outnumbered and that we should wait until we bring in help. However, the cousins exchange a look and silently head off with their backpacks to exact revenge. At this point, Nacho starts to panic. He sees reinforcements arriving for the other side and, to avoid arousing Salamanca's suspicion, he musters his strength to get out of the car and join the fight. Though Nacho only kills one person, it's enough to prove his allegiance. After massacring the unfortunate gang, the cousins head back to Mexico to lay low. Nacho secretly meets with Gus that night. Nacho thinks Gus is sparing him to use the Salamanca family to eliminate rivals and seize territory. But Nacho underestimates Gus, whose grand ambitions are known only to himself.
Get some rest. You have more to do.
Nacho was desperate. It looked like he'd never get out of the hole he'd fallen into. This is the world's largest processing facility for blue contraband. Under Walter's management, its products are not only distributed worldwide but also maintain a purity level of 99.7%. The factory's owner, Gus, has made a fortune from it. However, many people don't know how this mysterious underground factory was built. Today, we reveal the construction process. The factory site was recommended by Lydia, an executive at Madrigal, with Juan's approval for Gus to seek local suppliers, and Gus's chemistry prodigy Gale eager to showcase his skills. Gus appointed Mike as the project manager to begin construction on the laundry's underground factory. To maintain confidentiality, the engineers brought in from Europe were blindfolded for the entire journey to the laundry facility. While working, they were not allowed to leave the premises. After a quick survey, the first engineer told Mike the job was doable and could be completed in 6 months without any blasting, as long as the boss had the money. Mike then received a call from Gus. Gus, having secretly observed this engineer, deemed him unreliable and instructed Mike to send him back the way he came. This showed Gus's level of concern for the project. He would tolerate no mistakes. Soon, Mike brought in a second engineer, Werner. In the same manner, Werner proved to be more reliable. He conducted a thorough site survey and brought instruments to test the site. He drafted an execution plan in his notebook, stating that the existing structure needed support before excavation to prevent collapse. Werner admitted it was challenging and even calculated the approximate amount of earth to be moved. Due to the depth, Werner suggested blasting might be needed if they encountered rock. It was clear that this guy was highly professional, exactly the kind of talent Gus needed. Hiding in the shadows, Gus only revealed himself after confirming the reliability of Werner's plan. They introduced themselves, with the engineer named Werner from Germany, to expedite the project. Gus had already arranged housing for the workers, knowing the project could take 6 to 10 months without breaks. For safety, Mike suggested adding entertainment facilities to prevent workers from getting bored and trying to escape, along with 24/7 surveillance. Security is Mike's specialty, so Gus felt confident leaving it in his hands. Soon, Werner and the workers arrived at the living quarters. Seeing the excellent living conditions, they felt very satisfied. However, when Mike was about to lay down the rules, one man was unwilling to comply. Mike didn't argue with Kai on the surface, but Kai was now under Mike's watchful eye. Every day, they rode in airtight vans to work, unable to see the outside environment or know their exact location. Time flew by, and the basement's framework was taking shape. But construction projects rarely go smoothly. During their work, a worker accidentally hit a support column. Kai was instantly unhappy, knowing this would delay their return home. Months of working without seeing the sun had made them restless, leading to a conflict between the two. Though Mike quickly stopped the fight, the workers' longing to return home grew stronger. Mike then had a private chat with Werner. He saw that Kai was a destabilizing factor and wanted him gone, but Werner said Kai was the best blaster they had. Werner admitted that although Mike had provided excellent facilities, the nearly year-long project was really wearing on the workers. Mike realized he needed to give them a break, so he brought them to the bar. While the young men were having a blast, Werner and Mike chatted on the side. Werner talked about his loving relationship with his wife, mentioning this was the longest he had been away from her and how much he missed her. This scene also serves as a foreshadowing for future events in the storyline. Just then, Mike was called away by his men. It turned out Kai had caused trouble again. Mike used his money to settle the issue and had Kai taken away. Meanwhile, Werner, out of boredom, started discussing their project with a stranger, a very dangerous sign. Mike saw this and promptly pulled him away. The next day, Mike warned Werner about his behavior, telling him the consequences would be severe if he repeated it. Werner acknowledged his mistake and promised not to do it again. When Gus came to inspect the work, Mike reported that although progress was slow, the quality was assured. Gus understood the workers' desire to go home, and Mike assured him he would keep them in check. The project quickly progressed to the point where only one last rock needed to be blasted. They placed the explosives and drilled holes. However, as they prepared to detonate, a problem arose with the wiring. Werner, the engineer, decided to check it himself. Alone in the basement, Werner felt a sudden fear. With months left until completion, he couldn't wait to go home to see his wife. After fixing the wiring issue, Werner composed himself and emerged from the basement. A test confirmed the wiring was fixed, and the trucks outside were ready. They planned to use the sound of trucks hitting speed bumps to mask the blast.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now!
Having completed this crucial step, Werner saw an opportunity to request a few days off to visit his wife. He promised to ensure the work wouldn't be affected, but Mike refused. Knowing Gus's strict limits, Mike suggested that if Werner wanted to go home, he should finish the project as soon as possible, and then he would be paid well to go home. To ease Werner's longing, Mike allowed him extra time to call his wife. Realizing his request was now an unattainable luxury, Werner didn't press further. The next day, Mike went to the monitoring room. Werner had been on the phone with his wife for over an hour. With all conversations being monitored, Mike didn't restrict his time, letting him talk as long as he wanted, as long as he worked peacefully. When Werner finished his call, he began to watch the cameras in the living quarters, and the idea of escape was already in his mind. The next day Mike came back to the surveillance room and noticed that a few of the cameras had broken pixels. Sensing something was wrong, Mike hurried to check the living quarters. Upon reaching Werner's room, he found it empty, with only 2 project guides left on the table. Mike was furious and immediately ordered a search, but it was too late. Werner was nowhere to be found, with only a laser level left on the ground. If you encounter this person on the street, remember to keep your distance because you can never imagine his motive for killing. He is Lalo, the most terrifying assassin of the Mexican cartel Salamanca family, and the only one who can make Gus wear a bulletproof vest 24 hours a day, making him sleepless and uneasy. With Hector, the leader of the Salamanca family, down, and the violent Tuco in prison for assault, the cunning Lalo was sent over to maintain the family's power in the north. When Nacho first met him, he didn't sense the danger of this guy. After a brief conversation, Nacho realized that Lalo was also from the Salamanca family. Nacho knew well that there were no cowards in the Salamanca family, and he also realized that this new guy would be difficult to deal with. Although Lalo appeared to be all smiles on the surface, it was often such people who were the hardest to figure out. Nacho then took Lalo to the nursing home where Hector was staying. At this time, Hector was already paralyzed in a wheelchair. Through a simple conversation, Lalo managed to get a response from Hector's fingers, confirming that Hector's brain could still think. Lalo then told Hector about how he once killed a university professor and his family behind Hector's back and took something as a souvenir. That item was the professor's bell, which Lalo now gave to his uncle as a communication tool.
Vamos, tío.
It was because of this bell that Hector was nicknamed Tio Ding Ding. The uncle and nephew wanted to continue their deep conversation, but the disabled Hector stopped. Smart Lalo understood his uncle's intention and sent Nacho away. This clearly showed that they did not trust outsiders. The target they discussed this time was their rival, Gus. After saying goodbye to his uncle, Lalo immediately had Nacho take him to meet Gus. Gus, who was working, was interrupted by an employee who said that the man who came to make trouble earlier was here again. Since he was here, Gus had to entertain him. Gus first greeted him politely. Lalo then started to talk nonsense seriously, saying he wanted to meet the fried chicken boss. Gus admitted that he was the boss. Then, Lalo, under the pretext of wanting to invest in the fried chicken restaurant, was invited into the office by Gus. Lalo didn't hold back and directly revealed his identity, saying that he had admired Gus for many years and knew that Gus had built his empire from scratch. However, Gus didn't want to listen to Lalo's nonsense and politely asked him the purpose of his visit. Lalo said that he was there on behalf of the Salamanca family to thank Gus for saving Hector's life. Gus replied that it was just his instinct to save lives. The cunning Lalo wanted to test Gus's loyalty to the cartel boss, so he deliberately said that Don wanted him to create a feud with the Salamancas. However, Gus was too smart to fall for Lalo's trick. He firmly reiterated his consistent stance to make more money for the boss and obey all of his arrangements. Seeing that Gus didn't take the bait, Lalo said he would be staying in town for a while and would continue coming to eat fried chicken. After Lalo left, Gus's face instantly darkened. He knew that Lalo would be difficult to deal with. To find out more about Gus, Lalo asked Nacho to show him the chicken farm. At the same time, Werner, the engineer building Gus's underground factory, had escaped. This was a failure on Mike's part. After analyzing the situation, Mike deduced that Werner had not yet left the city. He then arranged for his men to search in different directions and left one to watch over the remaining workers. Mike knew that Werner would definitely have his wife in Germany wire him the money for his return trip, so Mike directly called the travel remittance office. Upon inquiring about the branch where Werner picked up the money, Mike headed straight for his target. At the remittance office, Mike pretended to be a family member of Werner, saying that Werner was diabetic and had early-stage dementia, and now that he was missing, his family was very worried. He also said that Werner had called his sister in Germany for money. Seeing that Mike's story seemed genuine, the staff believed him. Fred revealed that Werner had just left about an hour ago. In order to get more important information, Mike continued to pretend to be pitiful and gained Fred's sympathy. Mike successfully accessed the surveillance footage. From the surveillance video, Mike noticed that Werner, while on the phone, glanced at the advertisement rack nearby but didn't see what vehicle he left in. Meanwhile, Lalo had begun surveilling Gus's chicken farm. Seeing them hastily leave in their car, the clever Lalo deduced that something urgent was happening, so he put away his binoculars and continued to follow their car. It turned out that Gus had learned about Werner's escape and was rushing to meet with Mike. Mike showed Gus the engineering guide that Werner had left behind and assured him that Werner was just missing his wife and wouldn't report anything to the authorities. Gus also found out that Werner's wife was already on her way from Germany and would land in Denver in a few hours. Mike could see that Gus had already made up his mind to kill. As soon as they tracked Werner's wife and found Werner, it would be time for Werner to meet his end. In order to salvage the situation, Mike offered to find Werner before he saw his wife and take him back to work, saying that the project wouldn't be finished without Werner. Mike is only saying this to save Werner's life, but the boss's Gus and Mike's word is not his and he can only try to salvage the situation. Mike had his men retrieve Werner's last few call records. He attempted to find Werner by tracking down the taxi driver. Then, he called nearby hotels to ask if they had a guest named Werner. Next, Mike retrieved the call records between Werner and his wife, where they mentioned going to a natural hot spring resort. Based on this information, Mike quickly narrowed down a few resort hotels and started calling each one, but what Mike didn't know was that he was already being watched by Lalo Salamanca. What happens when a retired Special Forces soldier is hunted by Mexico's most dangerous assassin? At this moment, Mike was tracking the runaway Werner, unaware that he was being followed by Lalo, who had been tailing Gus. After Mike called and found out Werner's whereabouts, he instinctively felt that he was being followed. To confirm his suspicion, Mike made a sharp turn and noticed that the car behind him followed suit. Mike scoffed. He then took a pack of gum from the glove compartment, unwrapped a piece, and popped it into his mouth. Next, Mike drove into a nearby parking lot, with Lalo's car following closely behind. Once Mike had driven a bit further, Lalo also pulled into the parking lot. Mike parked his car, chewed another piece of gum, spit it out, and sandwiched it between two pieces of paper, flattening it. What Mike did next would leave you astonished. Mike waited for a car preparing to leave the parking lot. As soon as the driver backed out, Mike quickly positioned his car in front of he and drove away. Seeing this, Lalo hurriedly followed. This was exactly what Mike wanted. He inserted his parking ticket into the machine, and as the barrier lifted, he jammed the prepared gum into the slot, causing the machine to malfunction. After Mike drove off, the unfortunate person behind him was stuck at the gate. Fearing he might lose his target, Lalo rammed his car through, pushing the car in front out of the way. However, when he reached the intersection, he discovered that Mike had already disappeared. Next, Lalo, armed with a gun, arrived at the travel remittance office. He claimed to be a friend of the old man who had just been there and requested to see the same documents Mike had viewed. Fred suggested that Lalo call his friend and refused his request. However, while Fred took a call, Lalo vanished. Fred looked out at the open ceiling and heard footsteps from above, and then Lalo jumped down from the ceiling. Fred was instantly petrified. Using violence, Lalo successfully viewed the surveillance footage and found the records of Werner's wife wiring money to Werner. The poor clerk met his end just like that. Lalo got an idea when he saw the hotel advertisement that Mike had taken from the rack. Soon, Werner, who was lounging by the hotel pool, received a call from Lalo. Cunningly, Lalo pretended to be one of Gus's men. The gullible Werner divulged information about Mike and the underground project.
Michael, show him my letter. I explained everything.
No. Michael hasn't shared that with Mr. Fring.
The letter has specific instructions. My men will be able to continue a few days without me. The work will go on. Ask Michael. Michael.
Michael's very busy, and he asked me to speak with you. Do you remember what your instructions were?
Certainly. They are to finish clearing the debris, then begin the south wall.
That's the south wall?
The south wall? Yes. The concrete is standing by. They can stop pouring. It's very straightforward. Kai will not...
Fortunately, Mike arrived in time to stop Werner. Lalo wanted to continue extracting more information about Gus from Werner, but when the line suddenly went silent, he realized that Mike had found Werner. Werner tried to defend his actions, but an angry Mike didn't give him a chance to explain and told him to get dressed and leave with him. That night, Mike took Werner to a deserted area in the suburbs, called Gus to report the situation, and informed him about someone posing as Gus's man to question Werner. Gus said he knew who it was and instructed Mike to keep Werner there and wait. Mike knew Gus intended to kill Werner. He wanted to dissuade Gus, but Gus didn't listen. Mike looked at Werner in the car and then agreed to handle it. Knowing his only option was to ensure Werner had a dignified death, Mike told Werner to get out of the car and asked if he had considered the consequences of escaping. Werner, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, thought Mike was just extremely angry and that everything would be fine once he calmed down. It seemed Mike had been too kind to him. Mike explained that he had no say in the matter. Werner naively asked Mike to take him to see his wife, but Mike said that was impossible. Werner wanted to talk to Gus to explain, but Mike shouted at him,
Nothing you can say or do will make anyone trust you again.
Mike instructed Werner to call his wife and tell her to turn back, adding that she was being watched. Hearing this, Werner finally realized the situation was more serious than he had imagined. He took Mike's phone and made an excuse, telling his wife to turn back and not to come looking for him, but she was already on her way. Werner explained that there was an issue at the work site that the boss insisted he return to resolve, urging his wife to go back home immediately. Seeing that he couldn't persuade her, Werner reluctantly yelled at her.
Und ich will dich auch überhaupt nicht sehen, Margarete. Ich will dich nicht sehen, ja? Also, fahr zurück, nach Hause, sofort, jetzt!
Poor Werner's final goodbye to his wife was in the form of an argument. Now, the only thing he could do for his wife was to ensure her safety. Werner said that if he died and his wife couldn't find him, she would report it to the police. But Mike had already planned for this. Werner's wife would be told that he died in a construction accident, and the rest would be handled by lawyers. Werner understood Mike's difficult position and accepted the harsh reality, ready to face the consequences of his actions. Afterward, Lalo continued to investigate Werner, but no one he questioned knew anything. He also inquired about Mike. Sitting nearby, Nacho remained silent, pretending not to know Mike. However, Lalo was not someone who gave up easily. Based on the information he heard from Werner, he deduced that Gus was working on a mysterious project. Suspicious, Lalo asked Nacho if anything unusual had happened recently. Nacho replied that nothing major happened, just some local junkies complaining about the poor quality of the contraband. Lalo wouldn't overlook any small clues and asked Nacho to take him to investigate. On the scene, Lalo discovered that the contraband had indeed been tampered with. Since the goods were distributed from Gus's chicken farm, Lalo followed the trail back to Gus. Unbeknownst to him, this was a trap set by Gus to address Lalo's suspicions. Gus also called Juan to witness the situation. Knowing that Juan depended on him for money, this financial interest would make Juan side with Gus. Gus says he has a contractor in his legitimate business, the escaped Werner. Due to a moment of carelessness, Werner discovered the contraband. Unable to resist the temptation, he stole 2 packs and fled, only to be later found by his henchman Mike. Gus said he felt ashamed of his actions because instead of confessing, he bought 2 packs of low-quality contraband locally. This led to Lalo's men inadvertently taking the substandard product, causing the problem with their supply. Faced with Gus's flawless explanation, Lalo couldn't detect any flaws. He then questioned Gus about the project he was working on. Gus didn't avoid the question. Instead, he offered to take them on a tour. Gus had already prepared another project to substantiate his explanation. Gus said he was working on the most advanced chilled food chain in the Southwest, and that the workers working on it were all Werner's men. One stated that Gus had no reason to hide this information, as it would have prevented much trouble. Gus explained it was a misunderstanding. His man, Mike, had noticed they were being followed and didn't know who it was, so he tried to cover up the truth. Lalo recognized Mike, who was supervising on site, and requested to greet him. Gus readily had a worker call Mike over, as everything was under his control.
Michael, please meet my associate, Eduardo.
What a pleasure. I've heard so much about you.
That right?
Oh, yes.
I'm gonna get back to it.
Thank you, Michael.
Wow. That explains everything.
I am glad you are satisfied.
After Gus explained everything, one insisted that Lalo must cooperate with Gus, leaving no room for negotiation. Though Gus had quickly resolved the crisis, the distrustful Lalo didn't believe him at all. After leaving, one scolded Lalo for his reckless behavior and for killing the travel remittance employee, warning that it could land Lalo in trouble. Lalo, however, showed no remorse for his actions. He knew Hector had killed Gus's boyfriend, and naturally, Gus would hold a grudge against Hector, but Gus was such a successful businessman that the cartel boss and one relied on Gus to make money, which was Gus's only value to the cartel. Hearing this, Lalo couldn't argue further. Outwardly, he aligned himself with the company, but he certainly wouldn't let Gus off easily. With the situation over, Werner's workers are scheduled to return to their home country. Mike reminds them that even though they're only halfway through the project, they're being paid on a per-completion basis. To keep their mouths shut, he arranged different routes for them to leave. Before leaving, Kai couldn't resist remarking that Werner was too weak, which earned him a severe beating from Mike. What Kai didn't know was that if Werner hadn't spoken up for him, Mike would have kicked him out long ago, but Werner's character and ability was still recognized by his man, like this man, who expressed his dissatisfaction with Mike on his way out.
It was worth 50 of you.
Mike felt very helpless. He didn't want this to happen, but he was only a wage earner. After arranging for the workers to go home, Mike reported to Gus, assuring him that the workers would stay silent and that the underground project was sealed off. Gus stated that as long as Lalo was around, the project couldn't proceed. Mike thought Gus planned to abandon the project, but Gus intended to find a way to get rid of Lalo and then resume construction. During the downtime, Mike would continue to be paid. Getting something for nothing is not a consistent principle of Mike's. Gus insisted it was an advance payment and didn't hold Mike's oversight against him. Gus also arranged for a lawyer to compensate Werner's wife. Mike expressed his displeasure with Gus's decision to kill Werner, wanting to argue, but Gus warned him to watch his tone.
I would choose my next words very carefully if I were you.
However, Mike didn't back down and angrily retorted,
You keep your goddamn retainer.
With this, the collaboration between Gus and Mike also came to an end. The greatest pain in life is losing the only family member you have left, leaving you all alone. Although Jimmy and Chuck had gone their separate ways, Chuck was still his older brother. Chuck's sudden death left Jimmy deeply unsettled. Jimmy felt that Chuck's death was related to him. Just when he was feeling guilty and remorseful, Howard suddenly came and confessed. Howard believed it was his firing of Chuck that led Chuck to take his own life. Upon hearing this, Jimmy immediately shifted his guilt and self-blame onto Howard. The next day, Jimmy acted as if nothing had happened and scheduled a bunch of interviews for himself. Kim felt that Jimmy was acting a bit strangely, so she suggested that he take some time to rest and adjust his mood before looking for a job. But Jimmy stubbornly refused. He felt there was no need to wait, and besides, they needed the financial support. Seeing that her persuasion was ineffective, Kim had no choice but to respect Jimmy's decision. In Kim's view, Jimmy was just looking for another distraction to take his mind off things. Jimmy arrived at the parking lot of the company where he had an interview. Before getting out of the car, he brushed his hair and noticed he was starting to lose it. This was a direct reaction to his recent excessive stress. Jimmy was interviewing for a sales position at a store that sold printers. Before Mr. Neff arrived, the HR manager, Henry, gave him a brief introduction. Jimmy saw Mr. Neff's collection of Hummel figurines. Henry explained that these were left to them by Mr. Neff's late grandmother. Jimmy knew these figurines were valuable because he had a client who collected these art pieces. However, to Mr. Neff, these Hummel figurines were just junk.
Touring the wall of crap, I see. I need to drag that stuff to the dumpster, just haven't had a chance to motivate myself.
It could be said that Mr. Neff didn't appreciate their worth. This also hinted that this boss would not recognize the rare talent in the interviewee in front of him. Seeing that Jimmy's resume listed his previous occupation as a lawyer, Mr. Neff immediately felt that Jimmy wasn't suitable for the job. But Jimmy explained that lawyers are the best salespeople because they constantly have to persuade others in their work. Additionally, he had experience working in the mailroom of a law firm, so he knew various models of copiers better than he knew himself. Although Jimmy's points made some sense, after a few brief exchanges, Mr. Neff politely told Jimmy to wait for a response. However, just as Jimmy was about to leave, he hesitated and stopped. He felt his abilities hadn't been fully demonstrated, so he turned back to try to convince Mr. Neff to hire him on the spot. After a burst of eloquent persuasion and a passionate speech from Jimmy, Mr. Neff was unexpectedly convinced and agreed that Jimmy could start that day. However, Jimmy's next reaction left them puzzled.
Are you out of your mind? You don't know me. I just came in off the street. You guys are like a couple of cats. I come in, wave a shiny object around, you're like, I want that. No due diligence, no background check. No, just hire the guy that says them fancy words.
So you're not taking the job?
No, I'm not taking the job. Suckers. I feel sorry for you.
Jimmy stormed out of the store, feeling that someone like Mr. Neff wasn't fit to be his boss. Meanwhile, Kim received a notice from Howard and went to HHM law firm to help Jimmy sign Chuck's estate agreement. Also present was Chuck's ex-wife, Rebecca. Howard handed over Jimmy's share of the inheritance, but sadly, it was only a symbolic $5,000. In Kim's eyes, this was an attempt to exclude Jimmy without provoking any protest. Howard mentioned that Chuck had donated a substantial amount to a scholarship fund for disadvantaged youth, and he hoped Jimmy would agree to serve on the board. He then handed Kim a letter Chuck had left for Jimmy. However, just as they were about to leave, a furious Kim asked Howard to stay, saying she had something to discuss with him. After Rebecca left, Kim couldn't hold back and questioned Howard about why he said those things to Jimmy after Chuck's funeral. Howard explained that he felt he owed Jimmy the truth, but to Kim, this was just an excuse Howard used to ease his own guilt. To make himself feel better, Howard felt Kim's accusation was unfair, which only fueled Kim's anger further.
Hey, let's let Jimmy dig around the fire-damaged wreck where his brother died screaming! And then let's let him pick up a keepsake or two. That is so fair! Did I hear you right? You want him to serve on the board of a scholarship committee? A scholarship that Chuck never in a million years would have given to Jimmy. Never! It is just, oh, what's this too, huh, Howard? What's in this? One last screw you, little brother, from beyond the grave? Am I really supposed to do this to him?
Kim's sharp rebuke left Howard speechless. He wanted to make amends for the harm he'd caused them, but Kim did not accept it. She warned Howard to stay away from her and Jimmy. That evening, when Kim and Jimmy got home, they both kept their worries to themselves, only sharing the good news. Kim didn't give Jimmy the letter from Chuck, fearing it would make him feel worse. So, they decided to relax by watching a movie. However, they found an even more relaxing way to unwind than watching a movie. After Kim fell asleep, Jimmy thought about the Hummel figurines he had seen at the copy shop earlier. He quietly got up and went online to do some research, discovering that the figurine was worth over $8,000. Since the owner didn't recognize its value, Jimmy figured he might as well make better use of it. He decided to ask Mike to help swap it out. The next day, he met Mike at their usual restaurant and detailed his plan, proposing to split the profits evenly, but to Jimmy's surprise, Mike declined and advised Jimmy against doing it. However, Jimmy felt it was as easy as picking up money off the street. Given that he was short on cash, Jimmy didn't want to miss such a good opportunity, so he sought out Caldera to introduce him to a suitable thief. That night, Ira successfully infiltrated the copy shop. Following Jimmy's instructions, he quickly located the Hummel figurine. However, just as Ira swapped it out and was about to leave, he heard the sound of a toilet flushing. Panicked, he quickly hid. It turned out Mr. Neff hadn't left the store. He was puzzled about how the door had opened but didn't suspect a break-in. Through Mr. Neff's phone call with his wife, Ira learned that Mr. Neff had been fighting with his wife. Ira hid under a nearby desk, barely daring to breathe. Then he heard Mr. Neff order some late-night takeout. It seemed Ira wouldn't be able to leave that night. While Mr. Neff went to get the takeout, Ira hurriedly contacted Jimmy for help. Before Mr. Neff could finish his late-night snack, Jimmy triggered the alarm on his car outside. However, Mr. Neff merely stepped out to the doorway and turned off the alarm. Ira still couldn't find an opportunity to escape. In desperation, Jimmy managed to open the door and release the handbrake, causing the car to slip out. Seeing this, Mr. Neff rushed over to try to stop the car. Only then did Ira get a chance to escape. It seemed that getting those $8,000 wasn't going to be easy. The next day Kim took the opportunity to show Chuck's will to Jimmy. In the end, she couldn't resist giving Jimmy the letter as well. Kim intended to leave Jimmy alone to read it, but Jimmy stopped her. He wanted to share his privacy with Kim.
He brought a shine to her life that nothing else ever did, and I'm glad of that. New paragraph. We have not always seen eye to eye. I expect that will continue to be so in the future. However, nothing will ever change the fact that we are brothers, flesh and blood. And though we are very different people, I want you to know how much I respect what you have made of yourself in these last few years. You have taken the opportunity I gave you in the mailroom, and you have run with it, becoming a valued member of the HHM family. For all the problems in your past, I'm proud we share the name McGill. I sincerely admire your energy and resilience. I used to worry about you finding a place in the world.
Since it was a will, some parts were quite emotional. Tears welled up in Kim's eyes, but Jimmy showed no emotion as he read the letter. Kim felt out of control and wanted to be alone to calm down. She also knew that Jimmy was pretending not to express his real emotions. In the end, the director gave Jimmy a half-body shot, which also shows Jimmy's behavior to cover up his own heart. Jimmy just woke up in the morning to wash up and Kim suggested him to see a psychiatrist. Jimmy was bewildered. Wasn't this suggestion basically declaring him mentally ill? To avoid facing this issue, the cunning Jimmy lied, claiming he had already found a job as a sales manager and was starting work that day. Hearing that Jimmy had found a job so quickly, Kim was happy for him, but she still suggested he make time to see a therapist. Ever since Chuck's death, Jimmy's behavior had seemed very odd to Kim, so her suggestion was quite necessary. Jimmy, however, only pretended to agree. As soon as Kim left for work, he immediately contacted the job opportunities he had previously turned down. Fortunately, the cell phone store owner didn't refuse him, and Jimmy smoothly started his new job. But to Jimmy's surprise, he didn't see a single customer the entire morning. The only call he received was from his boss. The boss, well aware of the store's situation, suggested Jimmy bring a book to read while on the job. This clearly indicated that a mess had been handed to the newbie to manage. It's well known that salespeople earn their pay through performance. Without any sales, Jimmy could only earn a pitiful base salary. Bored, Jimmy had no choice but to pass the time in the store. By the next day at noon, he still hadn't seen a single customer. During his lunch break, he hurried to handle his own business. Jimmy successfully swapped the Hummel figurine from the copy shop owner through Ira. Today was the day for them to split the proceeds. Ira had a legitimate day job. Seeing his partner arrive, he promptly handed over half of the money from auctioning the Hummel figurine to Jimmy. Jimmy counted the money carefully and found it was much more than he had expected. Ira explained that the auction had been highly competitive, driving up the final price. Jimmy was surprised by Ira's honesty. He could have given Jimmy much less, but Ira had his own principles. He didn't want to do a one-off job because opportunities like this were rare. He wanted to form a long-term partnership with Jimmy. Ira said that whenever there was another good deal, Jimmy should call Caldera and get him involved. Jimmy wondered why they had to go through Caldera if they all knew each other. Ira explained it was for safety reasons, to avoid phone calls being monitored. This comment sparked an idea in Jimmy's mind. He realized the enormous potential market for private phones. So, Jimmy grabbed a paintbrush and started advertising for the cell phone store. Jimmy's advertisements were always eye-catching, using just 2 colors to outline striking words. The message was, "Being monitored? We sell privacy." Before long, a car drove past the store, and Jimmy used his usual magic trick. It never failed. The car backed up and returned. Jimmy hurriedly began his sales prep, pretending to make a call with one of the phones and asking the newly arrived customer to wait a moment. After finishing the fake call, he dramatically snapped the phone in half, creating the exact impression he wanted the customer to see. Jimmy pretended to be busy while the client briefly described his needs. Jimmy assured the customer that this phone was tailor-made for him and would perfectly solve his problems. He then took out the phone to demonstrate it to the customer. Jimmy explained that for safety, the phone had to be destroyed after each call. After Jimmy's talk, the customer has a strong desire to buy. However, Jimmy snatched the phone back, saying these phones were already reserved by other clients. Jimmy deliberately created a sense of scarcity.
Thanks again.
Tell your friends.
There's no denying Jimmy was a sales genius. That evening, Jimmy found Kim's favorite movie, but Kim said she had work to do and no time to watch. Seeing workaholic Kim, Jimmy couldn't sit still either, saying he also had unfinished work, but Kim pointed out it was already 9 p.m. Jimmy said he wanted to make a good impression on his new boss. Jimmy always found a good reason for his actions. He went to the cell phone store, used his own money to buy a batch of phones, and then drove off to try to sell them. Jimmy approached some small-time thugs, but his attire made them think he was a cop. But this small hurdle couldn't stop clever Jimmy. He immediately drove to the nail salon where the rent wasn't due. And then he found a decent outfit. Jimmy's streetwise look made him more approachable to his target customers. He went to the hot dog stand where the thugs hung out and started his crazy sales pitch. Jimmy used to be a punk, so he knows what these guys need. Privacy was their pain point, and Jimmy's phone sold like hotcakes because of it. Just as his business was booming, a gang of arrogant bikers roared in, scaring off the other thugs. Instinctively, Jimmy hid in his car, but after a moment's thought, he decided to take the risk and try to sell the remaining phones to others. This might seem like a fool's errand, but Jimmy had seen it all. He'd even dealt with the terrifying Tuco. These thugs were nothing in comparison. Jimmy started with a simple self-introduction and then analyzed the various benefits his product would bring them. As a result, his efforts paid off, and Jimmy successfully sold all the phones he had brought. However, to Jimmy's surprise, the 3 thugs he encountered earlier were watching him and robbed him of his hard-earned money, beating him up in the process. Kim, awakened by the noise from the bathroom, saw the injured Jimmy and quickly grabbed some ice from the fridge for him. This incident made Jimmy reflect on how he used to be one of those thugs. Yet now he couldn't sense the danger approaching him. Jimmy realized it was time to see a therapist. The next day, he wiped off all the ads from the glass, then went to the probation office for his pre-trial diversion check-in. Unfortunately, he ran into Howard in the restroom. Howard looked quite haggard, concerned. Jimmy asked what was wrong. Howard replied that he had already told Jimmy a lot. It was clear that Chuck's death left Howard feeling guilty and remorseful, and he hadn't been able to get past it, just as Kim had suggested to him. Jimmy suggested Howard see a therapist, but Howard said he was already seeing one, twice a week. It seemed that some issues couldn't be resolved by therapy alone. They required personal effort to overcome. Jimmy tore up the therapist's number and flushed it down the toilet, then headed to the probation officer's office. Jimmy officially answered a series of questions from the probation officer and stated that he would come here regularly over the next few months. He added that once he regained his law license, he planned to start an even bigger law firm with his partner, better than the previous one. This had always been Jimmy's goal.
Lawyer. Yeah. Lawyer.
While Jimmy was sound asleep, Kim quietly picked up his notebook and began to flip through it. On the first page were the law firm names that Jimmy had come up with using their names. The second page had a rough sketch of the law firm's logo designed by Jimmy. Starting a law firm with his girlfriend Kim had always been Jimmy's dream. Even when he was forced to shut down his practice, he never forgot about this goal. However, Kim's plans were completely different from Jimmy's. After surviving a car accident and going through a series of recent upheavals, Kim began to reassess her career. Kim felt that as a lawyer, she should do something more just, so she started to focus on cases from public interest lawyers, aiming to provide free help to those who couldn't afford legal representation. However, one person's energy is limited, and Kim's actions led to her neglecting her Mesa Verde Bank clients. Although she had an assistant to handle the bank's affairs, issues still arose, prompting Paige to issue a warning to Kim. In order to better serve her major client, Mesa Verde Bank, while also having time to handle public interest cases, Kim approached Rick at SC Law Firm for a collaboration. Due to the previous car accident, Kim was unable to continue serving new clients, so she referred the oil tycoon's case to Rick. This left Rick owing Kim a favor. Furthermore, Kim brought the major client Mesa Verde Bank into the collaboration, which was a huge win for Rick. Making Kim a partner in the case was a natural decision. After reaching the agreement, Kim immediately confessed to Jimmy. Although it was a bit harsh for Jimmy, Kim had to reveal her true thoughts.
I like it. I'm good at it.
This line sounds familiar, although the meanings are similar. Walter used the past tense while Kim's is in the present, indicating Kim's current and future commitment to helping others as a public interest lawyer. Jimmy also expressed his plans. He intended to become a criminal defense lawyer once he regained his law license. Just as Kim said, it could help people. On the surface, Jimmy said nothing, but inside he was deeply disappointed because he had been preparing for them to start a law firm together. Kim's decision essentially announced the end of Jimmy's plans. Jimmy excused himself to the bathroom, but in reality, he was hiding in the kitchen to calm down. Judging by Jimmy's actions, it seemed like he was deeply hurt. After coming to terms, Jimmy encouraged Kim to go ahead and do what she wanted to do. After all, it would still be half a year before Jimmy regained his law license, and who knew what might change by then. Later, Jimmy went to HHM Law Firm to collect the $5,000 left to him in Chuck's will from Howard. When Jimmy entered, he noticed many workstations were vacant, so he asked Howard what was going on. Howard didn't hold back and frankly admitted that the firm had faced some setbacks recently and its reputation was not what it used to be. This situation was undoubtedly linked to Chuck's death and also had something to do with Jimmy, perhaps out of guilt. Jimmy urged Howard to pull himself together. After tasting success from selling phones on the street last time, Jimmy used the $5,000 he had just received to buy a batch of phones to start his side business. Seeing Jimmy move all the goods into the nail salon, Mrs. Nguyen was not pleased. As soon as Jimmy finished his phone call, she confronted him. Mrs. Nguyen didn't want Jimmy to run his phone business in her shop, so she came up with various reasons to try and stop him. Seeing that Mrs. Nguyen was determined to go head-to-head with him, Jimmy had no choice but to resort to his usual methods to solve the problem.
That's on me. No, it's prepaid. 350 minutes.
Get-rich-quick schemes never work.
In Mrs. Nguyen's eyes, Jimmy was an opportunist, which hit Jimmy right where it hurt. From the lesson he learned from being robbed last time, Jimmy knew that to continue his business, he first had to deal with those 3 thugs, so he took the initiative to find them and seek their cooperation. Jimmy candidly admitted that he wanted to keep doing business there and was willing to pay each of them $100 a day as a protection fee, but the 3 thugs didn't listen to his nonsense at all. They didn't take Jimmy seriously, because they had enjoyed the benefits of robbing Jimmy last time. $100 a day wasn't enough to satisfy their appetite. They now wanted to rob Jimmy again.
You talk too much. All right, we got a man of action.
They chased him down quickly, cornering him in a dead-end alley. What they didn't know was that they were dealing with Slippin' Jimmy, the once street-smart hustler. They were dragged to a secluded spot and given a serious lesson by Jimmy. Jimmy had called in Huell and Ira, his previous collaborators, to help.
I had friends, did ya? So what's it gonna be, fast or slow? It's gonna hurt like a bitch either way. What was that? Was it slow?
We're sorry, man, all right? We're sorry.
Yeah, you are. Very much so.
Look, we'll leave you alone, okay? We won't mess with you anymore.
Easy to say now, but what about tomorrow?
I'll swear, man, I'll swear on anything you want me to.
Cross your heart and hope to die?
Yes, man.
Jimmy's actions proved who the real king of the streets was, and he cleared the way for his phone business to continue. This is the world's most hilarious bodyguard. Whenever he sees someone threatening his boss, he doesn't hesitate and jumps right into fight. Unexpectedly, the guy he beat up turned out to be an undercover cop. Poor Huell was immediately arrested for assaulting an officer. To plead for Huell, Jimmy, who had been so tough-talking just a moment ago, instantly softened. He agreed to the police's suggestion and stopped selling phones to street criminals, but it was already too late. The cop revealed that Huell had been arrested years ago for theft, and just now Jimmy's attitude is very tough. If not for this stupid bodyguard in time to come over, the police really can't do anything to Jimmy. Huell's ill-timed intervention not only doesn't help his boss, however, he is facing 2.5 years in jail. Fortunately, Jimmy is a good boss who couldn't bear to see his subordinate go to jail because of him. So, Jimmy started thinking of ways to get Huell out. Since he could no longer practice law, Jimmy had no choice but to seek help from Kim. At this time, Kim had been working as a partner at SC Law Firm for several months. The company's benefits were excellent. Not only did they give her an Audi, but she also had a super luxurious private office. Jimmy had visited Kim's office before. Seeing Kim's thriving career made Jimmy feel a bit down because it meant it would be hard for Kim to quit her current job and start a law firm with him. Jimmy described to Kim the situation where his subordinate mistakenly injured a cop. Hearing that Jimmy was selling phones on the street to thugs made Kim think he was being reckless. However, Jimmy asked Kim not to mind these details and started planning a way to rescue Huell. Jimmy found out that this cop had a DUI record from a few years ago and planned to use it to set him up. But Kim vetoed this plan. Kim agreed to help Jimmy, but only on the condition that they couldn't target the cop directly, since he needed her help. Jimmy didn't argue with Kim's point of view. Soon, Kim went to negotiate with Suzanne, the DA in charge of the case. Suzanne was very surprised to hear that Kim was defending a criminal with a record who also assaulted a cop. No matter how much Kim explained, Suzanne didn't believe Kim's words. However, Kim had done her homework before approaching Suzanne. Suzanne has 5 cases of civilians assaulting police officers. Compared to the harm Huell caused the cop, the other cases were much more serious, yet their sentences were lighter than Huell's. Kim felt this was very unfair to her client, but Suzanne argued that Huell had a criminal record while the others were first-time offenders. Suzanne wondered why Kim was involved in this case and said something that made Kim feel very unhappy.
There is no negotiation here, Kim. And honestly, I don't understand why you want anything to do with this. On one side, I've got a decorated police officer doing his job. On the other, you have a professional thief who threw him to the ground. And our only witness is a disbarred lawyer who peddles drop phones to criminals.
Hearing this, Kim felt there was no point in continuing the discussion and angrily grabbed her bag and left. She planned to have Jimmy take her to find Huell to discuss the matter. Kim said that Huell going to prison was inevitable. She could only do her best to reduce his sentence, but Jimmy was not satisfied with this outcome. He decided to find another way.
You do your thing, I'll do mine.
Jimmy, come on, what does that mean?
Don't worry.
On the way back, Kim worried that Jimmy might do something outrageous, so she kept thinking of solutions to help him. After coming up with an idea, Kim drove straight to a supermarket and bought various kinds of pens. Once she had everything ready, she immediately informed Jimmy.
Jimmy, whatever you're doing, don't. Yeah, I know, but listen, I have a better way.
The next day, Kim drove Jimmy to the Albuquerque bus station. Jimmy boarded the bus heading to Huell's hometown. On the bus, his task was to write letters pleading for leniency for Huell, as if they were from Huell's family members. This was the preliminary work to get Huell released. To increase efficiency, Jimmy hired a few passengers on the bus to help with the writing. By the time he got off the bus, Jimmy had 2 full bags of letters. Next, he went to the post office in Huell's hometown to mail all these letters to the DA in Albuquerque. When Jimmy returned, they began the final preparations for the next day's battle. Jimmy gathered dozens of phones at the nail salon to handle the DA's callbacks. The next day, Kim arrived early at Suzanne's office to negotiate, bringing a few colleagues to help in raising various issues to benefit Huell. But Suzanne was not intimidated. She reminded Kim that Huell would go to jail no matter what. But at this point, Kim looks more like she's winning. Soon, Suzanne's boss, Judge Benedict, came to reprimand her. He suspected that Suzanne was prosecuting Santa Claus and showed her all the letters he had received. Suzanne suspected Kim was behind this, but they had no evidence. Kim, of course, would not admit it and took the opportunity to highlight how respected Huell was in his hometown. Kim also revealed that people from Huell's hometown were organizing to attend his trial in court. Hearing that a crowd was coming to the courthouse, Benedict got upset. He told Kim and Suzanne that he had reviewed Huell's case and found no need for such a big fuss. Benedict then instructed Kim and Suzanne to quickly resolve the case. This shifted the pressure onto Suzanne. Back in her office, Suzanne immediately gathered her team to verify the origins of the letters. After reading the content, Suzanne felt Benedict might be right. It did seem like they were prosecuting Santa Claus. One of her team members noticed a letter with a phone number, so Suzanne called to follow up. What Suzanne didn't know was that this was all orchestrated by Jimmy. Jimmy had brought in his old partners from his commercial shoots, and their teamwork was flawless after many collaborations.
How could you? To go after someone so sweet and kind with all those lies? Well, I tell you what I really think of you, but Jesus is listening, so I'll just say, shame on you!
Suzanne was left feeling utterly embarrassed. Jimmy couldn't stop praising the performance of the makeup girl. Suzanne's team even found photos of Huell doing charity work at a church online. Seeing the contact details, she immediately called the pastor. Unbeknownst to her, this website was also set up by Jimmy with the help of some college students. When the pastor's phone rang, Jimmy quickly had the sound guy mimic the ambient sounds of a church. Jimmy then fabricated some heroic deeds about Huell. By the end of his spiel, Suzanne was beginning to doubt her own position. Just as Suzanne was about to hang up, Jimmy casually asked about Huell's trial date, mentioning that the church planned to charter several buses to the courthouse. This matched with the information Kim had previously disclosed, and Suzanne was completely convinced. After the call, Jimmy set up the team to handle incoming calls while he went to Suzanne's office to wait for the outcome of Kim's negotiation. Once Kim came out, they found a quiet place to celebrate their victory. Afterwards, they reviewed their operation, seemingly enjoying the success that shortcuts brought them. After a brief moment of intimacy, Kim quickly returned to work. This meeting was about issues Mesa Verde Bank encountered during its expansion. Kevin believed the booming business at one branch was due to the bank's architectural style, so he wanted to use the same design for the new branches. However, the new branches couldn't achieve Kevin's desired effect due to space constraints, and the plans had already been submitted for approval. It was too late to make changes and restart the process. Kevin asked Kim if she could work a miracle for his idea again, but Kim said it was impossible. Hearing this, Kevin had to abandon his last-minute idea. After the meeting ended, Kim fell into deep thought. She looked at the cork of the sapphire gin bottle she'd got when she and Jimmy had first teamed up to cheat someone. This item was a testament to their wild antics. Having just tasted the sweet victory of defending Huell, Kim wanted to use similar shortcuts to benefit Mesa Verde Bank's clients. She then approached Jimmy to discuss the matter. Jimmy initially thought Kim was there to reflect on their actions and promised not to take shortcuts again, but to Jimmy's surprise, Kim proposed doing it again. In the next scene, Kim pretended to be injured, hobbling on crutches to the Building Safety Bureau. She approached a staff member, explaining that she was missing a version of the blueprints during filing because some room dimensions had changed and she wanted to verify them. Seeing that Kim meant no harm, Shirley agreed to her request. After a brief check, they confirmed there were no issues with the previous version. Seeing Kim injured, Shirley asked with concern what had happened. Through their brief conversation, Shirley learned that Kim was a mother. After finishing the verification, Kim placed the blueprints she brought into a paper tube. Next, Jimmy, playing the role of the dad, entered with a bag. They started acting in front of the staff. Shirley's attention was entirely on their argument, and she didn't notice Jimmy placing the milk bag on the blueprints. When Kim returns to see the milk-soaked blueprints, she acts very worried, fearing that it will delay her boss's project. Shirley reassured Kim, saying there was no need to worry. The blueprints they had just verified were identical and could be used as a replacement. However, Shirley didn't know that Kim had another modified set of blueprints in her paper tube. In this way, Kim discreetly swapped the approved blueprints without anyone noticing. After a busy day, Kim finally achieved her goal. Later, they continued to celebrate their success, with Jimmy's suspension nearing its end and his recent phone sales accumulating a variety of clients. Jimmy realized they all needed legal services. After their recent successful collaborations, Jimmy felt that working with Kim in this way could be very profitable. But Kim, being rational, outright rejected this idea. She said that taking shortcuts could only be used for good deeds. Hearing this, Jimmy retorted, asking if what they had just done could be considered a good deed. Kim didn't answer because she knew their actions were unethical, yet she couldn't resist doing it. It also reflects the authenticity of the character roles. Everyone is a bundle of contradictions, and people often make instinctual choices when faced with temptation. It is precisely these momentary choices that can lead one down a path of no return. After a grueling one-year suspension, Jimmy finally had the opportunity to reclaim his position as a lawyer. However, to get his license back, Jimmy needed to pass the Bar Association's review. Prepared for all sorts of questions, Jimmy confidently answered each one during the review. Although Jimmy felt very confident in his answers, the reviewers' reactions seemed to indicate they were not satisfied with his responses. They told Jimmy to go home and wait for the results, which would be out in a few days. Skilled at reading people, Jimmy felt uncertain, so he didn't leave immediately after the review. He waited to catch the reviewers afterward and inquire about his results. Although the auditor did not answer directly, but from her expression can be seen that Jimmy did not pass the audit. Unable to accept this outcome, Jimmy rushed back inside to confront the reviewers. Even though they had already left the meeting room, Jimmy didn't give up.
Please! Mr. McGill, I can't...
I did everything right.
It was a question of sincerity.
What?
Some members of the committee found you somewhat insincere. You're free to apply again next year.
He chased them down to argue his case. Hearing this news, Jimmy lost control and threw his bag against the wall in a fit of rage. At the same time, Kim is still waiting for the good news of Jimmy's reinstatement. She used nail polish on Jimmy's cup to add another again. She also secretly customized a handbag for Jimmy to prepare for this to celebrate Jimmy. Soon, Kim received the bad news from Jimmy. Immediately afterward, Jimmy went to Kim to vent his frustration about not being able to endure another year of suspension. Kim advised Jimmy to calm down, but Jimmy was too upset. Feeling that he had answered every question thoroughly and yet they still found him insincere, Jimmy recounted all the questions and his answers to Kim, seeking her analysis on why he was rejected. Listening to him, Kim noticed he hadn't mentioned Chuck at all. Chuck was a significant factor in Jimmy's suspension, and shortly after Jimmy's suspension, Chuck had committed suicide. Kim believed that Jimmy should have mentioned Chuck and expressed remorse over his death, but Jimmy disagreed. To him, Chuck was a painful scar that he didn't want to reopen. Jimmy didn't think this should be a reason for his rejection. As an observer, Kim understood the reviewer's mindset. Jimmy's insincerity was evident in his avoidance of the Chuck topic. Reasonable and independent, Kim didn't blame Jimmy but suggested he might find a way to appeal. However, Jimmy, having lost his composure, felt that Kim didn't believe in him. This led to a huge argument between them.
Make a big hairy deal about my dead brother at my reinstatement hearing? How is that sincere? Yeah, I don't think about Chuck, okay? I don't miss Chuck. Chuck was alive and now he's dead and that's that. Finito. Life goes on, so sue me.
I have been on your side since the day we met. Who comes running when you call? Who cleans up your messes? I have a job, but I drop everything for you. Every single time you confess to a felony on tape, I'm there. You have a bar hearing, I represent you. Fun like lying to the ADA to get your friend out of the shitter? Or fun like standing there with a smile plastered on my face while you play infantile mind games on my law partner?
Oh, what a mistake it was to take me up to your office in the sky. You'll never do that again.
Yeah, maybe I won't. And maybe next time you call, I won't come.
There you go. Kick him in when he's down.
Jimmy, you are always down.
Impulsiveness is a devil. Jimmy's irrationality also directly angered Kim, but fortunately Kim is a sensible and independent woman. She did not take it personally. Later that evening, when Jimmy returned home, he seemed to realize his mistake and regretted his words to Kim. He packed his bag, ready to leave. Seeing the dejected Jimmy, Kim ultimately decided to help him.
You still want to be a lawyer? Well, we can start with that.
A few days later, Jimmy visited Chuck's grave to pay his respects. It was the anniversary of Chuck's death, and given Chuck's standing in the legal community, many people were expected to come to mourn. Indeed, Jimmy encountered some colleagues there. To help Jimmy successfully obtain his law license, Kim came up with the idea to have Jimmy demonstrate sincerity to the Bar Association staff. In order to build his persona, Jimmy donated a reading room in Chuck's name at great expense so that he could attract congratulations from his peers in the legal profession. The donation was announced anonymously, but Jimmy had already arranged for Makeup Girl to leak the news. This would highlight Jimmy's sincerity without revealing his ulterior motive, since part of Chuck's will was to fund students in need. Jimmy was fortunate to be on the voting committee. The selected students would introduce themselves and explain their scholarship applications. However, each person's introduction was cut short, and their full explanations were not shown. What they said didn't matter, as the scholarship recipients were already predetermined. When Howard announced the voting results, Christy, who received only one vote, was the one Jimmy voted for because of her excellent grades. Others didn't vote for Christy because she had once shoplifted from a supermarket, but that experience sparked Christy's deep interest in law, and Jimmy believed she deserved a chance. Given that Jimmy was Chuck's younger brother, Howard couldn't disregard his opinion and asked for a re-vote on Christy. The result was clear. Christy still didn't get the scholarship. As Christy was leaving, Jimmy caught up to her and gave her some advice.
They are never forgetting it. As far as they're concerned, your mistake is just, it's who you are. And it's all you are. And I'm not just talking about the scholarship here, I'm talking about everything. I mean, they'll smile at you, they'll pat you on the head, but they are never, ever letting you in. You are going to cut corners, and you are going to win. They're on the 35th floor, you're going to be on the 50th floor. You're going to be looking down on them. And the higher you rise, the more they're going to hate you. Good. You rub their noses in it. You make them suffer. Because you don't matter all that much to them. So what? Remember, the winner takes it all.
Because Jimmy saw himself in Christy, he once made a mistake and was so helpless. Jimmy's words were also a message to himself. To get what he wanted, he needed to take shortcuts by any means necessary. When Jimmy was ready to leave the HHM law firm, his Suzuki broke down again. Jimmy was devastated. Even his car seemed to betray him at his most vulnerable moment. After regaining his composure, Jimmy returned home to find Kim had already prepared a speech for him. With all their groundwork, they couldn't afford to fail now. but Jimmy felt a lack of confidence, thinking of himself as a failure. Convinced the bar association wouldn't change their opinion of him, Kim encouraged him to stay positive. Jimmy suddenly remembered the letter Chuck had left him and thought to use it to impress the reviewers. Kim also came to support Jimmy in this appeal. She advised him not to worry too much about the outcome, assuring him that no matter what, she would always stand by his side. According to the plan, Jimmy took out the letter from Chuck and began to read it. However, he stopped after just a few sentences. He noticed the reviewers were indifferent and realized continuing wouldn't show his sincerity. So, Jimmy decided to speak candidly and expressed his heartfelt remembrance of Chuck in his own sincere words.
I was going to try to move you all with my brother's eloquent words. You know, pull on your heartstrings, but it's not right. This letter's between me and him, and it should stay that way. He was the most brilliant man I ever knew, and an incredible lawyer, you know, and he knew exactly who he was, exactly. And all my life, I wanted to make him proud. Lucky few who reached that peak, even for a moment. If you made him proud, wow, what a feeling. And he let you know it too. But if you weren't one of those people, he was polite enough, but he did not suffer fools, you know? And he could be judgmental and difficult, and he knew how to get under your skin. I mean, look at me. I'll never be as moral as him. I'll never be as smart. I'll never be as respected. I'll never be as good as Chuck. But I can try. I can try. If you decide and I get to be a lawyer, I'll do everything in my power to be worthy of the name McGill.
Jimmy's speech successfully captured the attention of the reviewers, even moving Kim, who stood beside him. This time, Jimmy managed to demonstrate his sincerity effectively. Just when they were happily celebrating this victory, Jimmy's words suddenly scared Kim.
I could tell by their faces it wasn't going to be enough, right? So I just went off on this flow, you know. I had this energy going through me. It was like improv or jazz, and then boom, I sunk the hook in.
Kim had believed that Jimmy's earlier speech was genuine, only to realize it was all an act. Jimmy even mocked the reviewers who were moved by his words, which clashed with Kim's values. Then the staff came to ask Jimmy to sign, which means he has passed the audit and can get back his lawyer's license to practice. Jimmy requested to change his name because the clients he had gathered over the past year knew him as Saul Goodman.
Saul Goodman.
Thus, Saul Goodman, the lawyer specializing in defending criminals, was officially born. Although Kim felt something was off, she didn't realize that this would change the course of their destinies.